Chapter 26 Second day of the trip. There were many people who were on edge, and it was understandable. There had been an assassin in our ranks, so people became wary. But when the convoy was stopped a couple hours before noon in order to give everyone some downtime, a meeting was called. Turns out, the assassin wasn't someone of the Tavera family. Apparently, all those of the family were given a tattoo, and the assassin didn't have one upon inspection of his corpse. Apparently, he had killed one of the people of the convoy and managed to board without raising suspicions. This was in part due to a mask he wore, one that was constructed to look just like the victim he replaced. Regardless, the assassin wasn't a traitor, which eased most of the worries. However, as a precaution, the entire convoy went through a small inspection. There was a list of everyone on the convoy, along with a hired muscle like myself and Plex. And one by one, each member of the family was called upon to inspect their tattoo. Every tattoo was placed on the center of the chest. The symbol was of two sabers crossed between each other, the blades pointing to either shoulder. Each blade also had two different inscriptions written on them, while the hilts bore red ruby charms. This tattoo was only given to members of the family who had sworn themselves after reaching a certain age and going through a trial by fire. And there was nobody besides Plex and I who wouldn't have the tattoo. After all, this was a very sensitive mission. Nobody who wasn't absolutely loyal or trustworthy to the family would be brought on this trip. So with the captain, Plex and I watched as everyone on the convoy was inspected. Everyone passed with ease. Nobody who went up was nervous, because none of them were assassins or spies. However, when everyone had stepped up and gotten inspected, the inspector ran through his list and frowned. He walked up to the captain and reported, "Sir, there's one person who didn't show. Is it the victim who the assassin impersonated?" "No." The captain went quiet and looked back toward the convoy. Then, he looked toward Plex. "Can you find him?" "Sure thing, friend. Unless he already bailed." Plex smiled and suddenly disappeared. After that, the captain and I waited. We saw the occasional door open on the vehicles, but otherwise, there were no sounds. After a mere minute, Plex reappeared in front of us, shrugging. "There's nobody inside the convoy. So they either left last night or have stealth skills that surpass mine. Let's pray it's not the latter." The captain grumbled before turning back to the inspector and muttering some things. "Mark him as dead, and if anybody finds him, he's to be arrested on sight." "Understood. Then let's get rolling." With that, the convoy resumed its journey. As we drove, I hung around inside one of the turrets. It was an enclosed extrusion on the top of the hunker with a single narrow window that circled all the way around it, like a peel box. This way, you could attack without worrying about getting hit. For the most part anyway. I wasn't there for several hours, half sleeping and half enjoying the sights of the landscapes that we passed by. Being able to see miles of untouched land was a rarity on Earth, especially in America. It was always either farmland, towns, or cities. So genuine wilderness was new, not that I hadn't at least been to some national parks. I even saw some new animals that wandered around the road. When the sun began to set though, Plex suddenly came to me with the day's dinner. It was a large bowl of meatloaf and some weird veggies. "Eat up. The food is probably going to get worse as we go, so enjoy it while you can." "Right. Oh, since you're here, let me ask you something." I spoke while dropping down from the turret, keeping Plex from leaving. I sat on a stair while taking a bite, as did he. Yesterday, I was a bit on edge. And then an assassin popped out of nowhere. Now that he's dead, I'm perfectly fine. Can you tell me what that's all about? "Yay. That's your attunement into aura." He confirmed my guess as if it was obvious. Being aware of auras naturally reveals certain things about people, even if you don't realize. This is what normal people call a gut feeling or their sixth sense. The people who have a really good gut feeling have a higher attunement into aura than normal. But when you actually realize your aura, that gut feeling gets far stronger and more accurate. Okay. So were you feeling nervous? Ha! That's funny. Plex snickered at me and took a swig of alcohol. And on second thought, it really was a stupid question. I've never actually seen Plex nervous about anything. The only one he treated with seriousness was Ryan, and that was for good reason. That psycho could hurt me just by looking at me. Thinking that far, something suddenly clicked. Hey, during our delivery for Ryan, when I had those visions and was hurt. Yay, that was him fucking with your aura. That man is feared for several reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is his attunement into aura. Aura is a mysterious thing. It's far rarer to tap into it than to be blessed with a crest, and those who can get good with it are prodigies among those few. How he can do what he did, I have no idea. It's a field that nobody knows anything but the basics about. I see. Plex's words made me curious. On one hand, there was Ryan who could induce hallucinations and nightmares by interacting with other people's auras. And on the other hand, there was Plex who could rein in and conceal his aura. Along with invisibility, it made him virtually undetectable. You wouldn't know he existed until he was right in front of you. Two totally different ways of wielding aura, and both of them had great application. I surely had a lot to learn. And with that in mind, I turned back to Plex. Hey, can you teach me to conceal my aura like you do? While I was at the Magisterium, there was somebody who was able to predict my shots because of it. They said my intent wasn't concealed. Yeah, your intent and aura are two different things. Sure, your intent spills out through your aura, but concealing your intent is much easier than concealing your aura. And how's it done? Fine, I guess I can dispense some wisdom to my protege. Plex took another sip and sat up a bit. You can conceal your intent by controlling your thoughts. By doing something similar to emptying your mind, you can prevent others from predicting your next action. Basically, if you aren't thinking about your next moves, then they have nothing to sense. That's why knights train their instincts, because if they move based on instinct instead of conscious thought, then they can't be predicted. Okay, and what about aura? That's a whole different deal. Controlling your aura isn't simply taught, otherwise everyone would be controlling it like intent. Your aura is your conscious thought and more. It can reveal your emotions, your character, the state of your body, even your memories. That's why they say aura is the bridge to the soul. His explanations made me realize that aura was far more complex than I thought. I had thought it was synonymous with intent. But it also confused me. I thought back to the past days at the Magisterium. I had been writing formations in the air by infusing my psyche into my aura. This made my power appear externally, and the way to control my aura better was to simply practice controlling my aura with psyche. And thinking about it, I realized it was incredibly simple. Psyche was the power of the mind, and aura, while holding details about all aspects of yourself, was mainly a reflection of the mind. The power of the mind controlling a reflection of itself. Psyche was the perfect tool to control aura. Was this why I was able to get as far as I did despite being new to this whole thing? Then again, I didn't think other summoners were doing as I was. Perhaps it was just my luck, having something as expensive as my coat to help me break through that barrier with force. Suddenly, I narrowed my eyes at Plex. How did you learn to control aura? Me? Well, I had shown talent for it in the military, and they imparted some techniques to practice it. After that I was trained by someone and I learned aura concealment. So it can be taught. You just don't want to actually teach me. Hey, they were very complex techniques. Besides, you couldn't even use the practice technique. It was tailored to using vigor, not psyche. If you want something for you, go ahead and ask Maxwell. I already have a practice technique. That's why I'm asking about learning to conceal it. Plex's eyes turned a bit wide in surprise. Seeing a hint of skepticism though, I decided to prove it. Concentrating, I managed to write a few segments of my practice formation, the lines appearing in the air with a glow. I had gotten better after practicing, but there was still a long ways to go. It was enough to prove my ability to Plex though. After gawking a bit, he scoffed. You're a little monster, huh? I think this much talent is necessary in order to survive the trenches. A little narcissistic too. I smirked at his jab, earning a sigh. Whatever. Look, I'm not gonna spend the next 5 years training you to conceal your aura, but since we're inside this damned hunk of metal and I'm bored shitless, I don't mind throwing you a bone. Thanks. Just listen, and we'll find out how good your talent really is. Plex leaned back into his seat, rummaging through his memories and lecturing in a way that seemed as if he was reciting lines from a book rather than from his personal experience. I didn't mind much though, because anything that could give me hints was good enough. I was certain that being able to conceal my aura would become an invaluable tool as a ranged fighter, even beyond other applications of aura like what Ryan showed me personally. Of course, Plex's lecture wasn't just a bunch of words that he spewed from that alcoholic mouth. He so generously showed off some spell formations, simultaneously warning me that they pretty much only worked for nights as they were formed from vigor, not psyche. Not that I could immediately use them anyway. The formations were incredibly complex, yet I still managed to guess that they were similar to the practice formation that Maxwell gave me. I primarily listened to all the theory about concealing your aura, how it involved not just a brutish method of containing it within your body, but obscuring it. Plex had long since mastered the method to obscure his aura, and now, he was skilled in the art of truly erasing his aura entirely, making his existence undetectable. Of course, he wasn't the best. Apparently, compared to some people that he knew of, his skills were barely adequate. At the same time though, these people he compared himself to were also the best in their field, and one of them was a rather legendary assassin. They were people who couldn't be found unless they wanted to be. Plex described the presence of that legendary assassin as fading. You could be looking right at them and your mind still wouldn't be able to process that there was a person in front of you. He even spoke of another whose presence wasn't fading, but so obscured that even a small glimpse at them would induce hallucinations and cause a small bout of hysteria and paranoia. Obscurity so great that it scrambled the minds of others, unable to be comprehended. In a tangent, he continued to explain that the ways to manipulate aura, despite their rarity, were incredibly vast. There was one point he eventually led me to though, and that was how you can only utilize one primary path of controlling your aura. For example, Plex could conceal his aura, but because he had practiced and mastered that method so much, he would never be able to learn how to induce mind-damaging hallucinations like Ryan did. You could basically only choose one ability, and so he urged me to deliberate carefully whether I wanted to learn concealment or not. Because at a certain point, it became a path of no return. Of course, I didn't think I would regret learning concealment regardless of that fact. It was too useful, even if only people like Plex, who could make themselves invisible, could capitalize on the ability to its fullest. From there on, he continued to lecture. The talk only lasted a couple of hours since Plex didn't feel like continuing into the night. Eventually, the convoy settled for the night. The vehicles continued to roll, but all the bunks were filled as people retired. We couldn't settle for long though. Only an hour after everyone had gone to sleep, I suddenly woke to an explosion. An alarm went off, and everyone threw themselves out of bed. Enemy attack. Chapter 27. It was the first real attack on the trip. It seemed like we would have to be on high alert from now on. I scrambled around a bit, as my entire bunk room was flooded with bodies. Because of that, despite the urgency, I waited for about half a minute as everyone got out of the way. When I was finally allowed to step out of my bunk, I headed straight for my turret. I always wore my coat since it was my greatest form of protection, especially on this dangerous trip, so I didn't need to equip it. Instead, I merely threw on my gloves and air mask before climbing into the little pillbox. From that vantage point, I was able to look around. The convoy stopped rolling after being intercepted. It seemed the enemies had prepared an ambush and managed to bring us to a halt. Not unlike us, they had vehicles of their own. There were small cars that had slammed into the vehicles in front of us, forcing us to stop. And from the safety behind these cars, warlocks launched spells while others ran over and tried to raid. Suddenly, I saw a bright fireball headed for me. I suddenly ducked, and my head was graced with a bit of warmth as a few tongues of flame flickered through the window before fading. As I rose back up, I contacted the dimension of my authority. I found what I wanted, a rifle that looked somewhat similar to all the others with its wooden body, but holding a few key differences that made it a unique spirit. When I grabbed it, its memories flooded into me. This time, it was much smoother and more brief than the first time I had communed with it. Memories of a marksman from the American frontier. He wasn't known for his quick draw or skill with a pistol. Instead, he was known for his long-range shots. And he was made capable by the rifle in his hands, one of the first of its kind, potentially the progenitor to an entire line of an extremely popular modern weapon configuration. The sniper rifle. Of course, it could barely be considered such. The rifle was specifically known as the Remington Lee. It was the first rifle to utilize a box magazine and was a bolt-action rifle. The man in the memories had fought in the Spanish-American War and later obtained this rifle privately after retiring from service. The rifle was then modified to mount a telescopic sight, technically making it a sniper rifle. And it was used as such. It was precisely tuned until he could reliably hit human-shaped targets at upwards of 250 meters away. He even opted for the heavy .45-70 Gov, allowing the rifle to pack enough punch to hunt even large game like bison. In the end, this rifle was heavily modified from its original factory configuration. It wasn't a well-known rifle and came from a time before the firearm revolutions of the Great War, but compared to the other rifles I could attain, this one was no doubt the best, especially at a range. I mounted this rifle on the window of the turret box, taking aim at the targets near the front of the convoy. They weren't more than 70 meters away, so I didn't have to adjust my aim as many would need to do with the slow .45-70. I placed the crosshair of my sight over the body of a warlock casting magic from the roof of a vehicle. At the same time, I faintly recognized the markings of the Clockwork Association. Asterisk bang asterisk. I pulled the trigger, and despite aiming at the warlock's head, it was his chest that let out a violent puff of red. He collapsed at the same time, slumping off the vehicle. After that, racked another round, finding another target. My primary targets were the warlocks casting magic. Normally they couldn't be easily touched since they often cast magic barriers to combat incoming spells and knights set to close distance to harm them. And since bowmen were outclassed by warlocks, they basically didn't exist. But I defied all conventional notions of combat, being able to fire small projectiles at extreme speeds. These bullets were masterful at piercing magic barriers because of their size and instantaneous power, and so long as that happened, the warlock behind it would surely die with their soft, fleshy bodies. However, occasionally, there were some warlocks that wore garments with sufficient protective measures to stop a bullet. While shooting, I managed to find 3 of such warlocks. Unfortunately, these warlocks still died. It wasn't because their gear was lacking, but because it simply didn't cover their head. They never wore armor like knights, so their heads were normally exposed. This allowed me to simply place a bullet between their brows, even if I had already shot them. I found the opportunities to do so after they walked out from their cover. When my first shot failed, they would get startled before retreating behind their vehicles. But after realizing that I left behind nothing but a bad bruise, they got brave and came back out, only to meet their end seconds later. Like that, I basically took out every warlock in the ambush. And this was despite the hunger I was in getting attacked. I wasn't worried about my back, because the Tavera family was a family of knights. They were the best at close combat, so our vehicles would only get boarded in the worst case. Because of that, I would likely be the last one to get hurt or die in any battle we faced during this trip. I just needed to do my part in taking out the enemy's warlocks before they could do any real damage with powerful spells, something the Patriarch basically hired me to do in the first place. And I did my job perfectly. While breaking down magic barriers forced me to empower my bullets a bit, it was nothing I couldn't do with these. So with that, the battle flipped. The Tavera Knights went on the offensive and killed everyone else after all the warlocks had died, since they no longer had to worry about incoming spells. and since I didn't want to accidentally shoot somebody, I stopped not long after. I watched as the battle concluded. The corpses and vehicles were looted for anything valuable like white crystals before being discarded. It was a bit eye-opening to see the knights pick up and throw the vehicles with only a bit of strain, the hunks of metal crashing off the side of the road and out of the convoy's way. And before long, we were back to rolling. Before I could sink back into bed though, the captain came and found me. "Thank you for your good work, John. We suffered only a few major injuries and no deaths. That wouldn't have been possible without you killing those warlocks. I must say, it's a bit surreal having such a major advantage like you with us to establish dominance. I understand why the Patriarch personally hired you. Thanks, Captain. Expect more of it in the future. Unless it's a really powerful warlock, I should be able to kill them with only a few shots." We shook hands with a smile. To outright eliminate the threat of spells really was a game changer. Without me here, these knights would have to carve their way through the enemy knights in order to kill the other warlocks, and during that time, dozens of spells would rain down on top of them, potentially killing many before they could finally turn a battle into their favor. Even with your own warlocks, you had to wait and defend while the warlocks of both sides tried to kill each other. It could take a long time for that to happen and would similarly result in many more casualties. But I could directly eliminate them. Killing warlocks could be said to be my forte. So instead of the warlocks determining the tide of battle, that right had been given to me alone. The battle would be determined by how fast I could kill the opposing warlocks. The captain seemed to have discovered that this battle, which led to his next words. "Yes, you keep doing what you did tonight. I plan to have a meeting tomorrow to discuss this as well. With you here, all we have to do is wait until you can eliminate those warlocks. I want the others to understand this detail so we can adjust our tactics and reduce our injuries and deaths. Of course, I also want your input. If there is anything we should know, then do tell us." I couldn't help the slight anxiousness at the sudden proposal. The captain was basically saying that he would adjust their battle tactics to revolve around my ability to take out enemy warlocks. This meant that future battles would hinge on me alone. It was a sudden onset of responsibility that made me worry about whether or not I could perform. I was confident in my ability to kill warlocks, but now there were people who would be relying on me. If I failed, things could go wrong. Although I couldn't really think of any reasons besides a sheer power difference that would cause me to fail, I still initially shied away at the responsibility. But I was a variable that nobody had accounted for on this trip. This meant that the captain fully believed that he and his knights would need to kill all warlocks on their own. So even if I failed, the result could only be better than if I weren't here at all. I only brought benefits, regardless of how much. This thought brought back my confidence, but I still didn't intend to take full responsibility for the outcomes of these battles. This dictated my next response. "I understand, Captain. I don't mind you changing tactics, but your knights still need to be ready to do things themselves. I alone can't win an entire battle, and I don't want people becoming complacent thinking they can just rely on someone else to keep them alive. That is natural, of course. I never intended to put everything on your shoulders. But my men will at least know that they can act more defensively instead of recklessly attempting to kill well-guarded warlocks." "Sure. That's no problem. I'll do my best regardless, and those warlocks will be my first targets. So long as I'm not hindered, I don't see any reason why I can't get rid of them all." "Very well." Our conversation concluded with that. Afterward, the convoy went back to sleep, and I went to bed with thoughts of accomplishment. Although we had cleanly avoided any deaths and dispatched the first wave of enemies with relative ease, the convoy was still on edge. Another attack could come at any time. I also overheard some conversations about displeasure among the fighters, their targets being the scouts. We were supposed to have people devoted to alerting the entire convoy in the event of an attack, giving us some time to prepare before being bombarded. Although it didn't seem like much, even just a few seconds could be valuable time to begin preparing. Apparently, that was the secondary job of the few warlocks who were on board. They knew spells that could detect anomalies in a wide area. And a few vehicles worth of people were definitely anomalous, so it was a wonder why we weren't alerted well in advance. Hearing about this didn't anger me much, but I also wasn't nearly as urgent as the others. They had to get out and fight, and without time to prepare their gear, they could be caught with their pants down. Sometimes literally. I didn't even have to go outside, just hiding away in a fortified pillbox with my rifle. But I still felt some empathetic indignation on behalf of the other fighters. In the last battle, injuries could have been avoided if the scouts did their job. Unfortunately, it seemed like I had initially been missing a few details. When evening of the next day dawned, I asked Plex about the situation while eating dinner. Apparently, the assassin and his missing partner had both killed and assumed the identities of 2 warlocks on the convoy, cutting down on the already small number of warlock personnel. After all, why wouldn't you attack the one glaring weakness of a convoy full of knights? Without warlocks, they would have a much harder time fighting back. And this made me even more valuable than before. It was no wonder why the captain wanted to revolve his defensive tactics around me. I was better at killing warlocks than other warlocks and made up for their weakness perfectly. Well, unless our enemies didn't find out who I was and specifically counter my actions, I could continue to work unhindered. Perhaps that was a bit much to ask though, because I had already established a high level of renown in the black market. I was too iconic, so perhaps it was only bound to happen. A matter of when, not if. Chapter 28. Another day passed uneventfully, and the tension only grew despite not having been attacked again. We would arrive in only 3 more days. For the most part, I had been focusing on learning what I could from Plex. And the surprising part was how I actually made some progress. Through practicing the formation that Maxwell gave me, I was able to hone control over my aura. And through Plex's teachings I was actually able to restrain it, just slightly. If wasn't enough to make a big difference. Plex said that aura was like a shining light. Being able to restrain it only made the light dimmer, and I couldn't dim it much. To him, my aura was still as obvious as daylight. But the fact that I could even attempt to conceal it was shocking enough. It was so much so that he basically stopped teaching me after calling me a freak. Plex was one of the few people who knew that I hadn't even activated my first authority when I arrived at the capital. So to go from that to actually exercising control over aura in only a bit over half a year was baffling to say the least. I understood this as well, but it wasn't like I could apologize. Not even I knew why this was coming easily to me. Was I supposed to explain my talent somehow? Then again, I wondered in the back of my mind if my talent had something to do with the fact that I came from another world. My authorities and summons were obviously tied to my origins, so perhaps I really was given something special upon arrival. Well, to suddenly be thrown into a world of magic when I came from a world of nothing but science was a jarring change, so it was only right that I was given something to ensure my life here. Consider it compensation for being murdered by a robot truck. I found myself smiling. During the 4th day of travel, the scouts were at full alert at all times. We were expecting attacks at every hour of the day, and I was beginning to understand what Plex had told me at the beginning of our trip. People either became anxious or complacent as time went on, and the convoy had chosen the former. Nobody went without their gear on, and the atmosphere was constantly somber. It was like they were expecting to die or something, which made those with relatively good moods sour. I was included. I wasn't anxious, but it was difficult to be around a bunch of people with such bad moods. At some point, I was basically praying for the battle to hurry up and get here so that these knights would get out of their head and just swing a sword around. And maybe that's exactly why they waited so long. It was a mind game. The 4th day passed slowly, but it passed, and nothing happened even during the night. Plex told me to get some sleep and even to sleep in as long as I could. He said that they would strike when we were most vulnerable, and that was when everyone was tired. Sure enough, the 5th day rolled around, and nothing happened so long as the sun was up. As soon as the moon came out though and night fell, it happened. Enemy spotted. There was a yell, and from under my covers, my eyes shot open. The entire convoy woke up. We hadn't even gotten an hour of sleep, but we were forced out of bed. And not long after, I heard the explosions. Except, unlike the first time, this explosion rocked the entire hunker. I was thrown out of my bed as the vehicle quaked, threatening to roll onto its side. But it righted itself under gravity, and everyone continued to rush out. "Have fun, John," Plex yelled while disappearing, causing me to scoff before rushing to my turret. Peeking through the window, I spotted an enemy convoy toward both our front and back. We were brought to a standstill, and the frontmost and rearmost vehicles were being raided. Spells also came en masse, flipping the smaller trucks and exploding amidst our knights. They were responding with trained reactions, but several already had wounds. I didn't delay, communing with my scope rifle and taking aim. My priority, as discussed with the captain, was to take out the warlocks. That was my only job, and how many people died hinged on my performance. It was a lot of pressure, especially now that it was time to make true on my promises. But I pushed myself to step up. Judging by the strength of their spells and what seemed like thick magical barriers in front of them, I could guess that the warlocks were more powerful this time around. So I empowered my rifle with a large amount of Psyche before finding my target and pulling the trigger. Bang. An explosion rang out through the battlefield as I felt the gun recoil into my arm. On the other end, I could see the warlock drop with blood spraying from his neck. It seemed I missed both his head and his chest, but managed to hit the side of his neck, taking out an artery. Well, he was also about 110 meters away, this intuitive sense of distance coming from the memories within the rifle. With that shot, I shook off some of my nerves. "You're good, John. You're good at your job. Just keep shooting. Slow and steady." I took a deep breath, settling my heart before taking aim again. However, before I could shoot another target, I suddenly saw a spell fly toward me. I ducked, and there was a large explosion of fire. Ow. Warm. I winced as a tongue of fire licked my face, singeing some of my facial hair and burning me a bit. After taking a moment, I put on my air mask before lifting back up. However, I could see more spells coming at me. I ducked as another fireball threatened to burn my air mask. Shit. They know it's me. I can't shoot like this. I realized that they had prepared specifically for me. Without me, they would have an easier time taking out the knights. I couldn't allow it, so I moved to another turret. But after firing a single shot, I was once again suppressed. Fuck. Fine. I'll go meet you myself. Since when have I been scared of close combat? Pulling out of the turret, I kicked open the door of the hunker and headed outside. All around me, I could see knights battling each other. The strength they wielded gave me goosebumps, reminding me just how weak I was in front of those types of magi. But I was being protected by them, and I couldn't let those damned warlocks do as they pleased. So I ran to a good location before taking aim, finding a warlock and firing. Bang. My gun flashed, and another warlock died. Of course, I was also spotted, and because they saw me beyond the metal fortifications of the hunker, I was attacked. I quickly ran behind one of the trucks as a spell hurtled toward me. Not all the ranged spells were fire, but they all had the familiar flashes of magic spells, giving them away. After that spell exploded where I was once standing, I relocated and fired off another shot. That shot didn't kill the warlock though, his barrier stopping it. These guys are strong. I muttered before relocating once again. I had to keep moving and shooting. And since that previous warlock was strong, I avoided him and targeted the others. Over time, I managed to kill 4 more warlocks with empowered shots. I also found 3 warlocks were strong enough to block my bullets. But with the pressure eased, the knights were doing noticeably better. In fact, we were pushing them back. I also wasn't getting focused as much, giving me more room to shoot. And it was all downhill from there. Our momentum snowballed as I continued to shoot those strong warlocks. I couldn't kill them since they kept strengthening their barriers, but my efforts still made them hide away. If they didn't avoid me, then I would eventually pierce through. But if they hid away, then they couldn't attack the knights. In fact, I managed to kill one because he thought he could strengthen his barrier before I could fire twice. Unfortunately, he underestimated my fire rate and one of my bullets snuck through after shattering his barrier, blowing a hole through his head. However, perhaps because I stayed in one spot for longer than normal, another spell was thrown at me. And it wasn't one from one of the weak warlocks. Those I had killed. No, one of the strong ones decided to focus on me. And I barely noticed when the spell was already heading toward me. I saw as a large ball of water came flying in my direction. It didn't look harmful, but I could feel the magical energy contained inside of it, which made me panic. In that moment, my jacket lit up with purple lines. I felt my mind speed up, everything around me suddenly moving in slow motion. And I threw my body out of the way, my muscles straining themselves to move as I commanded. Thankfully, that was enough to avoid eating the entire spell with my body. I dodged, the spell landing beside me. But then it exploded, and I was hit with a dense wave of water backed by shockingly powerful pressure. It was like being hit with a shock wave. The water dug into my side, and while it was stopped by the jacket, the impact still slammed into my arm and shook my organs. I was thrown a small distance, tumbling around before coming to a stop. I groaned as my head spun, but the adrenaline going through my body forced me to wake up despite the pain. I lifted my head, barely taking in the surrounding sights and making sure there were no enemies. I managed to catch a glimpse of the warlock who launched that spell, and the sight was a bit shocking. There was a knife going through his chest, and from over his shoulder, I could see Plex smiling at me. Plex dropped what was now a corpse before disappearing once again. I sighed, deciding that it was okay to take a few more seconds on the floor. With that, the battle was basically over. By the time I pulled myself up, the last few enemy knights were killed while any remaining warlocks were killed by Plex. I didn't even have the chance to shoot any more. But I had done enough. A majority of the warlocks were killed by me despite having been suppressed for a while, taking away almost all the pressure on the knights. I even killed one of the strong ones. When I remembered how I was actually being paid for killing enemies, I couldn't help the foolish grin that surfaced. Yeah, I've been counting too. This is gonna be one hell of a paycheck. John. My head suddenly turned at the call of the captain. He came walking over with a half smile. Thank you, John, once again. You helped us immensely. It's all right, Captain. How is everyone? Well, this battle wasn't as forgiving as the first. The captain explained the casualties. We had sustained a few deaths and several injuries. The healers would need to work overtime to heal all the wounded. We were also stopping for a time in order to recuperate. Heading forward would only be throwing ourselves into more enemies. In fact, the captain was entertaining the idea of driving the convoy backward for a while in order to recover before pushing forward once again, just in case there were enemies headed our way. But all things considered, we were still doing very well. They had expected many more deaths than this. I alone was saving many lives with my efforts. Well, I had to eat the explosion of a spell in the end, but otherwise I was getting off lightly. I also apologize for not being able to protect you. There's not much we can do about spells, so we couldn't keep you from getting suppressed. Still, your performance was great despite that. The captain gave his apologies, but I just reassured him. I had worked around it, and I couldn't expect perfect conditions while everyone was fighting for their lives. After a short discussion, we separated, the captain leaving to gather reports and help out. On the other hand, I retreated to the hunker where I took off my coat and took a look at my injury. My arm was bruised, as was my side, the surrounding skin turning a bit purple. But otherwise, I was completely fine. My head hurt more than anything, and I would have no issue shooting a gun right now if I needed to. The coat really was an amazing item. At the same time though, I wondered what level that warlock had been at. That attack was powerful, and if not for my coat's abilities, I wouldn't have reacted in time to dodge as much as I did. And in that situation, The blast from the water spell would have done far more damage than it did. Authority 6? I've only really had experience with Authority 4 single quote S and 5 single quote S, so I'm probably right since he was quite a bit stronger. You know, I wonder how strong people within these mafias are at the higher ranks? As I questioned, I suddenly saw Plex walk into the hunker. I decided to ask and waved him down. Plex. Yes, my name is Plex. How strong was the warlock you killed? Authority 5, at its height. Oh. I guess my estimation was a bit off. The strong warlock I killed probably wasn't at Authority 6 either. But this also gave me a reference for my limits. So I probably can't kill an Authority 6 warlock. Not unless you catch them off guard, and it gets rarer the higher their level. Plus, you can't compare these guys to those of the military, at least not the good ones. There are some techniques called perpetual spells that a warlock can maintain at all times, and they almost always use it for mana barriers. So you won't be able to instantly kill anybody competent, not unless you get much more powerful than you are. And many of these guys within the mafias aren't quite competent, at least not at the lower levels. Disappointing. Hey, be grateful you can kill anybody above your level anyway. I'll give it to you, John. Your summons really are something special. But they aren't impossible to fight against. You'll figure this out as you climb the ranks and become less able to kill those far above you. Yay, I figured. I could only nod, because I had thought of those things too. The only reason I didn't fret though was because my enemies were beginning to shift. In the future, I would be fighting more beasts than people, and they required a different set of tactics. Intelligence was much less of a problem. Instead, sheer power and crowd control was the name of the game. At least from what I've experienced so far. But so long as I was at the Magisterium, I knew that I would probably continue to take on jobs in the black market, especially if my services were requested like in this case. So I would still need to hone my skill in the art of human warfare, because right now, fighting people was far deadlier than fighting beasts. It was with these thoughts that I retired for the night. I didn't particularly care about what the captain had planned for the convoy. My only job was to respond when needed. But, in the back of my mind, I was also worried about the target on my back that seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. Chapter 29, Another Attack. The next morning, when the sun was only just beginning to peek over the horizon, everyone was walking by alarms in the yell of a warlock. Usually if I got less than 8 hours of sleep, I would feel groggy and even a bit sick. But I didn't feel any of that as the explosions of magical spells rattled the hunker and woke me with a surge of adrenaline. 5M. These guys really need to fuck off. My nerves had died down as of late. A couple of sudden battles was enough to condition me, at least to the point where I wasn't in a constant state of fight or flight and hyper-awareness. That was the only reason some of my irritation could slip through as I climbed up into a turret and took aim. I immediately took count, finding about 13 warlocks posted not just in their own vehicles, but in the forest beyond the road. We had hit a roadblock of boulders that seemed to have been placed by the enemy warlocks, and now we were being pincered from both sides. And this time, the warlocks seemed to be hiding behind natural formations a bit more, not just standing out in the open where I could shoot them. It made this more difficult, and because the sun wasn't fully out yet, it was a bit harder to see into the tree line. But with my scope, things were made easier. Plus, the lights from their spells made them stand out like beacons, guiding my crosshair. Learning from prior battles, every warlock had a barrier up, and all of them were strengthened. They were specifically countering me, and not every warlock was casting spells. They seemed to be searching. In fact, several were looking toward my hunker. It was clear that I had caused them no small headache, and perhaps now they were trying to do something about it. I knew that the moment I took a shot, I would probably be bombarded with spells. And if I stepped outside to try and reposition, then I would be putting myself in danger. So they wanted to pin me down or eliminate me entirely. So I waited, thinking of what I could do to help with this battle while avoiding the focus fire of a dozen warlocks. And then, it hit me. Why did I have to only shoot the warlocks? Why not the knights? I would have to use more power, but if I switched guns as well, then killing several knights wouldn't be a problem. But going outside at all was still a problem, even if I had more freedom out there as opposed to in a stationary turret. Suddenly, I thought of my most glaring problem besides the sounds my guns made. It was the muzzle flash, which was incredibly obvious considering how much I stood out in general. If I got rid of that, the eye would be golden. The sound was so loud that it couldn't be precisely traced at a distance, so I could still operate despite it. That's when I had an idea. Kicking open the door of the hunker, I headed out and crouched down. And looking at the vehicle, I smiled. Suddenly, I crawled under the hunker itself, taking up position on the ground. From there, I could see up to everyone's waist, and it was easy to tell apart the Tavera knights from the enemy knights. After that, I aimed my rifle. The knights were always much closer than the warlocks, so I didn't have to stress my aim. And since I was now onto this vehicle, I couldn't be hit by the warlocks. It was the perfect solution, so I aimed at an enemy knight with a smile, pulling the trigger. Asterisk bang asterisk. My bullet flew, and the knight that I shot buckled almost instantly. It gave a window of opportunity that the Tavera knight took immediate advantage of. With that, I let off round as fast as I could send them. I had to infuse a large amount of Psyche into each round just for the bullet to pierce through both armor and the tough bodies of the knights. But I quickly learned that my shots didn't have to be lethal for them to be effective. Suddenly getting hit by a bullet was a death sentence when you were also fighting against an enemy. It was a fatal distraction. So I even lightened up on the Psyche, focusing on my fire rate. And like that, the knights swept through their enemies. I didn't even have to kill the warlocks. With my assistance, the knights were able to pierce through all defenses and kill them for me. And I wasn't disturbed a single time, the enemy warlocks unable to deduce my position underneath the vehicle and behind the bodies of my fellow knights. And so the battle was won. After I crawled out, I could see everyone either getting treated or cleaning up. The captain also came and found me. "John. Excellent work." "Thank you, Captain." I smiled at his enthusiasm while we shook hands. "I saw exactly what you were doing, and I have to say that it was a genius tactic. In fact, because those stupid warlocks couldn't find you, they stood around hiding for half the battle. Just your presence alone is enough to disable them. And don't worry, even though you didn't kill anybody, you allowed us to kill those knights far faster than otherwise. I'll make sure you are paid for this battle." "Just doing my duty, sir." I felt a bit shameless, saying that while grinning ear to ear. I had to admit, the huge paycheck this was turning out to be was a great motivator. However, this battle did indeed take a larger toll on me. Even though I was smiling, my head was screaming at me with a migraine after using so much Psyche. I felt like I would pass out any moment. So I kept our conversation short, and my next stop was the bunk where I fell right asleep. I couldn't even be bothered with breakfast, and I slept until well afternoon. Of course, I woke up to a starving stomach because of that. Thankfully I had been saved some food, not by Plex, but by some of the knights. I was thanked to no end while eating, probably because they had received my direct help. I was also guaranteed protection by the entire troop, so it was nice to know that everyone would be looking out for me. I just told them to make sure nobody attacked the hunker, because it had basically become my nest. If I lost that, then I would be in serious trouble. After that, evening dawned. After this, we would only have to make it through one more day. We would arrive the following evening, and so far, everything was going amazing. I had barely been hurt, and deaths were minimal. Injuries were prevalent, of course, but in normal cases most of those injured knights would be dead. I had saved no small amount of lives, and even though the last battle was more difficult than the other, I thought we could make it through the rest smoothly. Unfortunately, thinking that seemed to have conjured quite the opposite. Because when the moon appeared high in the sky, I was once again shot awake by all too familiar explosions. Thankfully I was rested, so I didn't have issues responding. But when I saw what we were up against, I could only curse under my breath. It looked like an army was waiting for us. Of course, we had an army of our own, but we were tired. Thinking back, I suppose the healers had it the worst. Well, they would need to step it up pretty soon. Because when attacks were launched, copious amounts of blood was shed. And the pressure I was put under skyrocketed as these enemies sought the head of the American who had been causing no small amount of trouble. Shit. Breakthrough. Get those fucking vehicles out of the way. Someone kill that warlock. Asterisk bang asterisk. Screams and gunshots made my ears ring. I suppose I was finally getting a small taste of what war was like on Earth, in this case. Thankfully, my air mask filtered what I breathed, so I didn't get the dense stench of blood and fire. It was my only solace during these battles. While fighting, I thought back a couple of times to what I had surmised at the beginning of the trip. My conclusion was that the final days of the trip would be the hardest since the enemy would be more desperate, throwing everything they had at us. I knew it was bound to come, especially since I was here keeping a vast majority of the convoy alive through every battle. But I underestimated just how difficult it was going to be. Well, I couldn't be blamed either. After all, I didn't expect that another mafia would come and try to bar our path. For most of the time, we had been facing the Clockwork Association. But on the last day, not only did we fight 2 back-to-back battles with those damned warlocks, but another mafia known as the Yin Guild suddenly appeared. They were supposedly a rival mafia that operated in the only black market in the city of Joffron, our destination. And through the shouts and screams of battle with them, I learned that the Tavera family was attempting to encroach on their territory there. These mafias were more widespread than I initially thought. They hid slices of the black markets of several major cities. There were even entire villages that they controlled, these small settlements acting as places for their families to grow and produce more children who would later be inducted into the mafias. Of course, the capital was always where most of their power resided, so I wasn't missing much. But that was beside the point. There were naturally other mafias than the few I knew of, most being entirely localized to a single city. But that didn't mean they weren't powerful, and because they only had one nest, they didn't take kindly to others trying to intrude. Well, I knew there was more to the story, but that was all above my pay grade. I was only hired muscle who needed to help them reach their goals. Still, whatever the Tavera family was doing, it was enough to garner what seemed like the full force of their rivals. I wondered several times through the trip why our enemies didn't just send their full armies all at once. Surely it would be more effective, right? But this was wrong. Wearing down your enemy was effective, and striking when they were tired and when you were well prepared was the best. And, well, what they struck with when all was on the line seemed like their full army. It was like everything beforehand had only been a warm-up. Dozens of knights, many of which were terrifyingly powerful, and just as many warlocks. Not only that, but I finally got to experience a full-force battle between not a 36s, but a 37s. Turns out, the captain was an A37 knight, as well as the strongest person in this convoy. And after asking Plex, the highest power in the mafia usually stood around a 39. For the Tavera family, that was their patriarch. So sending in a 37 was big. After all, although the highest power was a 39, that didn't mean they had many or 38s. The Tavera family may have 2, at best 4, and leaving the capital wasn't usually acceptable under any circumstances. So a 37 was the best we had. Not that it was shabby. The captain was at the height of a 37 as well as someone who had served for many years in the military. He was experienced and powerful. And this showed in the battle he fought. Honestly, the entire thing made me want to cower. Atrocious strength and speed was basically all there was to it. The captain could create craters in the ground with his feet, tear apart an entire vehicle with his hands, jump higher than trees could grow, and attack with speed that my eyes couldn't keep up with. I quite literally wouldn't last a second if I had to fight him. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he could dodge my bullets. Of course, displaying such feats of strength took a lot out of him. There was a reason he didn't show such strength earlier. And perhaps more shocking was the enemy he fought, who was likewise a knight, but not the type you'd think. He was a martial arts specialist, someone who fought with his body. He wasn't just a boxer who only fought with his fists either. His kicks could take out the trunk of a tree, his fists blowing holes in steel, his arms and abs able to deflect blades, and his footwork allowing him to reposition with blinding speed and impossible agility. His body just floated around while he attacked the captain, and their fights took them to all corners of the battlefield. In one moment, they'd be right in the center of a dozen men, and the next, they would be flying over the tree line and laying into each other on the other side of a hill. Their power wasn't something I could wrap my head around. It was disorienting seeing it at all, because it was stuff I had only seen in movies and the like. To actually see it in the flesh jostled my brain. It was like it didn't want to think that it was possible. But the damage they wrought was very real. I could only thank the captain for keeping that pugilist from tearing apart the hunker I was hiding inside. But, other than that distraction, I was wholly occupied with trying to stay alive. For the entire final day, we bounced from battle to battle. It was like there was a long line of people just waiting down the road and taking turns beating us up. And every time, we sustained more damage. It built up. More deaths, more injuries, and greater exhaustion. We were lucky our convoy was large, because any less people and we may not have been able to make it this far. And there was no opportunity to rest. At first it was manageable. I would get tired, restrain my use of Seika, and gradually recover between battles. But as each hour passed, my mind's fatigue built bit by bit. First it was a constant headache, but then it turned into sharp pains that made me flinch with every surge of blood from my heart. Not only that, but I was attacked rather often. I had thought that I could just hide like I had, whether that was amidst the knights or around the hunker. But no matter where I went, it wouldn't be long before I was spotted by a knight or warlock and attacked. Running away from bloodthirsty knights was especially fun. My speed couldn't compare to theirs, so I was forced to move as fast as I could, delaying them with a shotgun, before getting an ally to save me. That scenario played out 4 times, and each time, I was pulled closer to death. The warlock spells that exploded around me weren't much better. No small amount of damage was blocked by my coat, but I still sustained several nasty bruises and a possible fracture in my left arm after getting slammed in the side by a large rock. Holding up a rifle became harder after that, and how I continued to manage was a miracle. But I did, even though I sometimes wanted to climb into the hunker and just hide for a while. But my willpower was strong. If there was one thing that I knew about myself, being one of my better qualities, was that I didn't buckle under pressure. Something about adversity like this spurred something within me, compelling me to step up and push back. It was a quality that only came out during sports, but here, it showed itself in full force when it really mattered. Despite the head-splitting migraines, despite the blood that dripped down my arm from a wound under my sleeve, despite the physical and mental exhaustion from trying to help while being hunted by knights and warlocks, I found it within me to continue surviving. And I never stopped shooting back. Ha! Ugh! I lay against one of the trucks while catching my breath, groans coming from underneath my mask. I felt some blood stream down the side of my head, a small wound from a small rock that came flying in from seemingly nowhere. What hurt the most though wasn't the wound it gave me, but the impact it had against my head that was already dealing with the nastiest headache of my life. Not only that, but my left arm throbbed with shooting pains every time my heart beat. It had been that way for more than a few hours now, and moving my fingers had gradually become more difficult. I concluded that my arm was broken, but unfortunately I couldn't get it treated in the middle of a battle. I barely even remember how I got that injury. In fact, so much as opening my eyes felt overwhelming. There was too much stimulation, the battle overwhelming my senses. But I couldn't close my eyes just in case I had to dodge another spell, nor could I just tune my hearing out and ignore what was going on. In the distance, I could see all the knights intertwined in fights. The tides were turning in our favor, the enemies of the Yin Guild falling beneath the sabers of the Tavera family. Pulling my gaze away, I looked toward the hunker not far away. From their turrets, the few warlocks that we brought were launching the occasional spell. Unlike me, who could get hit by fire and water that easily slipped through the window, they had barriers that could block all that stuff, letting them fire freely. Looking at that tank on wheels, I felt the urge to go over and climb inside. I just wanted some rest, and surely the hunker's defenses could afford me that. But at the same time, there was still more I could do. I learned through much pain that maintaining a communion with a gun basically cost as much psyche as I passively recovered. This meant I could keep a gun in my hands and shoot unempowered bullets as much as I wanted. Of course, bullets that weren't infused with psyche weren't as powerful. Depending on the conditions, the best they could do was pierce a knight's armor and damage a warlock's barrier, yet do nothing to the body underneath. But in this battle, those two things were enough. So when I ran out of energy, that's what I resorted to, trying to afford my allies any advantage I could. After all, a bullet to the face, although not enough to kill a knight, was still a nasty distraction equal to a sucker punch. And if I was lucky enough to hit their eyeball or mouth, then even an empowered bullet became lethal. Unfortunately, my accuracy also lowered when I was exhausted, so those chances were low. Still, my bullets afforded our knights many opportunities, sometimes outright securing kills. So I couldn't stop. The only tough part was that, with every shot, I needed to move. Having my position locked down was a death sentence, so if I wasn't ready to run, then I didn't want to shoot. Even the air mask couldn't keep me going forever. In fact, I had eaten food on the battlefield during a morning battle, trying to keep my energy levels up. Taking a piss also wasn't out of the question, though doing so while watching out for spells was an interesting experience. Ugh. Damn it. I just need a breather. There's food there too, and I'm starving right now. I grunted before deciding to head over. I ducked low before slowly making my way, arriving at the beat-up door to head inside. But that's when I heard something in the distance. A scream, getting louder and heading my way. I looked up. Tope continued,